All right, let's go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Multi-Channel AI, Improve Contacts, and Increase Revenue Compliantly. This webinar is being brought to you with the generous support of Skit AI. Skit.ai is a leading conversational AI company, enabling collection agencies and creditors to streamline and accelerate revenue recovery. Skit.ai's compliant and easy-to-deploy suite of multi-channel solutions featuring voice, text, email, and chat powered by generative AI delivers seamless and effective consumer interactions at scale, boosting recoveries and elevating consumer experiences. So I'm Missy Megason with Inside Arm, and I will be moderating this webinar. With me today is John Keelan, Vice President of Collections, Operations, and Strategies at Resident Interface, Mike Frost, partner at Frost Eccles, and Amit Umbre, Vice President of Customer Success at Skit AI. So now that we've introduced our panelists, I am going to turn off the slides and we can get started on the conversation. So thanks, John, Mike, Amit, for having this conversation with me today. I am really looking forward to this because I know that AI is on a lot of folks' minds these days, and so it's wonderful when we get a chance to talk about it. So today we're going to be covering these topics: IA implementation considerations, technical setup, the AI experience, and AI in the future. And I think I said IA before because I say IA all the time with Inside Arm. So what I meant was AI. Anytime I say it wrong, just know that I mean AI. You can't, it rolls off the tongue too easy working at Inside Arm. And we'll also be answering your questions. The registrants to this webinar submitted a ton of great questions, and we're going to cover many of them during our conversation. I've also got some time set aside at the end, so any that we don't cover in our discussion, we'll highlight on we'll highlight them and go over them individually at the end. So first, let's talk about voice AI implementation considerations and really multi-channel AI considerations, and what we should look for in a vendor. And John, I'd like to actually go to you first. From an ops perspective, those who are interested in artificial intelligence, what should they look for? What are some key factors from an ops perspective that you think are crucial or important?
So just some of the vendors that we vetted out, the questions are, you have some vendors that will maintain the modules and helping you to kind of perfect your AI bot, versus ones that want to turn over the training and basically the education to you to kind of help train and model your bot. So, I think some key things from an operational perspective is, do you want to invest time and resources on your side to have somebody who's going to be responsible for adjusting and doing things on a regular basis as you're learning? Or do you want to have a vendor partner who may maintain that for you and help you to work the inner workings of that AI bot? The other aspect, is when looking at this is how will it integrate to what your current telephony system is? Is it going to be SIP trunking? Is it, are you going to try to use a temporary path to like a call forwarding to get up and operational? So those are kind of like two of the main aspects that we started with right away, and just determining, what vendor do we want to go with when we're moving into the world of AI.
Wonderful. And Mike, I'd like to hear from a compliance perspective too. And I'll just, before you get into that, I just want to say one of the reasons that I asked John and Mike to be on this webinar is because I knew that John would be able to bring a wonderful operations perspective, and that Mike would be able to bring the legal perspective, and Amit would be able to bring the technology know-how. So this is kind of the first time that I'm kind of just going to run through and try to get all those perspectives for everyone. So Mike, how about from a compliance perspective? What are the key factors, key implementation considerations that you think folks should be looking at?
Obviously there's a lot of them, but the one that raises, to everybody's eyebrows is the TCPA, right? So we're always going to be focused on how do you comply with that process. And most of that really isn't driven by your vendor. Most of that's going to be driven by the consent language that's provided in underlying agreements with your clients and the actual consumer. So it's, identifying, where do you have consent from the consumer to utilize artificial voice, pre-recorded messaging, and ATDS. And a lot of times we'll get the questions from people when it comes in related to compliance is like, hey, is this company or this product going to be able to provide us, a compliant solution? And is it an ATDS? And quite honestly, when you're talking about AI in the voice bot process, it's really not about whether it's an ATDS or not. It's whether it's an artificial voice or a pre-recorded message. And the interesting thing about doing that analysis as well is sometimes depending on the product, and what the product is able to provide, it may potentially be a pre-recorded message versus an artificial voice. So it's really important to look at how that underlying decisioning element is built into the AI bot. How, is it a real-time process that they're able to decision along the way and it learns as it goes, or is it more of a scripted process like what we saw in the older days with more of a what it was called, IVR instead of an IVA? So is it more of a what if or if then statement that's going to provide back to the consumer? It's more scripted. And if it is, then there's an argument. It's actually pre-recorded. So you have to look at all those different elements to determine really what are you working with from an underlying system, and where's it going to fall within the matrix of the exclusions within the TCPA, and how do you overcome some of those hurdles and obstacles. So that'd be my first review of it. And then it gets into like some of the stuff that John was talking about is, how do you maintain as the engine is learning and coming up with response elements to different questions and that you're dealing with on the phone. How is it providing those responses, and is it real time? How does it integrate with some of the other systems so it can actually extract data in real time and help in that decisioning process? So there's a lot of different elements, and they're all interconnected, both the operational and the compliance pieces. So I would say if you're doing this, and John and I have done quite often, is if you're vetting out somebody for, whether it's AI or some other type of processes, get your ops and your compliance people together. John and I do it quite often, is get together, look at the stuff together and say, what's going to be, create the issue, because, compliance and operations is really something that's going to impact at the same time. It may look at a little bit different elements, but you kind of have to do that in conjunction with each other than trying to do it separate. It's going to help you evaluate those systems a little bit better.
That's a really good point. And I feel like in the collections world, compliance and ops are so integrated that one affects the other all the time. And this just seems, to your point, like a situation where going into it together can help identify what's key for for the organization. Um, I mean, I'm gonna ask you the same question. What should, from the vendor side, from someone that knows the ins and outs of how this works, what do you think that folks should look to when they're looking for a voice or multi-channel AI vendor?
I think John and Mike have covered most of the points, right? I think, and I'll also probably say compliance and integrations. I think those are probably two crucial elements, and they are kind of intertwined together, because, effectively want a solution which kind of well integrates with your systems, are able to kind of read to and read into your systems as well. So you kind of make it seamless, and then that kind of boils into compliance, because unless the records are updated real time, it becomes very difficult to kind of follow, the multiple compliance things which are in play. I think the other thing which I feel, is also important, I think, is the compatibility or the ability of the vendor to kind of work and fit into your processes, because it's never going to be a full AI system, right? There is going to be an human involvement in it, human involvement in terms of figuring out which are the leads which need to be given to the bot, human involvement in terms of the transfers which actually go to the agents, and kind of the ability to be able to kind of, work well with your operations and ensure that, things are kind of done in such a smooth fashion that, the bot kind of becomes an additional and add-on scalable agent, right? Rather than kind of an independent thing completely isolated. I think that becomes quite important, right? Because, obviously, the more integrated it is, the more value you can derive out of it. I think the other thing which is also going to be very important is, I think AI is evolving at a very rapid scale, right? And I think Mike did mention about IVR and then IVA, and I think now we are getting more into territory of LLMs, right? And large language model based kind of models. So you also need a vendor, because some of these LLMs, etc., the ability to pull it off, etc., you will need a lot of deep technical expertise. So kind of understanding whether your vendor is capable of kind of understanding this, knows, there are obviously going to be some additional compliance limitations which are going to come into play with LLMs as well, has a good cognizance from a technical perspective on how that will impact, and is able to kind of evolve as AI rapidly evolves. I think that is also going to be quite critical.
Wonderful. I want to thank all three of you for setting the table for us there. I wanted to ask that broad question at the outset. just to kind of get a broad picture of where we should be looking, and I think y'all covered it well. So let's try to drill down. We just talked about some key considerations and kind of broad scope what we're looking at, but let's try to drill down a little bit to technical setup. John and Mike, you both touched on compliance and ops working together, and it sounds like part of that is looking at that technical setup. And from what I've heard from folks just throughout the industry is that technical setup can feel very daunting, and feel like it's a hurdle that is too far to too high to jump. So I'd like to ask each of you, what do you think the priorities should be for an organization that's looking to have a seamless integration? What should they be looking at for a technical integration from an ops perspective and from a compliance perspective and from the vendor perspective? And I won't single anyone out for who goes first. Thank you, John, for letting me pick on you in the last question. But which one of you would like to tackle that first?
I think I can go probably because
Okay.
there's a fair of technical there. So I think broadly from a vendor perspective, when it comes to integration, I think I'll probably divide it into two modes, right? There's an outbound mode and then there is the inbound mode, right? So on the outbound mode from an integration, I think the good part is you have flexibility to kind of go live immediately, right? I think what's very important is kind of ensuring that there is a right quick data transfer mechanism, which is kind of set in place. I think the second thing is you obviously need to be very clear in terms of why are you going to use the bot, because obviously there are going to be multiple levels, and I'll just not kind of limit it to the bot. I think generally AI, right? Because there are obviously going to be multiple use cases which you are going to kind of use it. I think it's very important to kind of figure out which are those systems within your org which need to kind of be involved, need to speak, and need to interact to kind of make the best use of AI. How are the transfer mechanisms, or how are the information sharing mechanism with your ops team, with your kind of collectors on the ground? How is it going to work? I think being able to map that out is very important. I think once you've mapped it out, I think it also becomes very critical, because the success of AI is not just dependent on the AI vendor whom you're onboarding. It also is equally dependent on the other vendors or the other kind of partners who you are already working with on the CRM side, on the telephony side, etc. So kind of ensuring that that communication, because a lot of the times a vendor may not be integrated, an AI vendor may not be at the outset be integrated with the system which you are kind of already kind of working with, right? So effectively kind of setting those dialogues, kind of knowing, are there any technical complexities, or in certain cases, even commercial complexities, which might kind of play spoil sport, and, kind of being proactive, kind of address those. I think those things will be very critical, because the faster you can solve them, the better, or the faster the integrations kind of happen. And, the easier it will be to kind of get off ground. And remember, AI also has it has a transition, it has a ramp up period, because it's effectively intelligence like it's something which keeps on learning. So the faster you get off the ground, the more iterations, the more learning you can kind of build into the models, and the faster you kind of get the value out of it.
Well, thank you. It's helpful to understand that issue from the vendor side. And I know, John and Mike, I know you each have real world experience with actually doing this implementation. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this issue from the compliance and the business perspective.
Yeah, from an operational standpoint, there are some things you can start with using an AI bot without having to have an API integration. Where API integration becomes extremely imperative is when you're dealing with financial data, right? When you're going to be presenting an option for a consumer to make a payment, you're not going to want to load a file at 8 a.m. With their balance. And this consumer may access that same file or that account or call in at 4 p.m. And something could have transpired in between there where the bot is still reading from an old file. However, things like, getting a consumer a paid in full, being able to basically ask their preference of would they prefer an email or a text, loading one-time file where an account has been paid, and basically an eligibility flag. Those types of things, you don't necessarily need a complex API integration. There's a lot of them can accept an Excel doc. Most systems can export, records with a couple of different fields that you can upload to an SFTP that can drive a lot of different options and positions for this bot. So, the first step for us was kind of determining, our first time into AI, what were we looking to try to accomplish and learn? And then what do we ultimately, could we accomplish right up front without having to go to an API integration? And then what would we ultimately need to get to from an API integration? So I know some people love to start a project and want to be right at the finish line when they go live. For others, we do step-by-step ramp up. We're happy to take a 10 or 15% lift right off front of any agent activity or any manual effort that's basically being repetitive in nature. And we're happy with getting those 15 and 20% quick wins and then moving on to the next 15 or 20% quick win. So, just depending on what your, structure looks like or what you want to go and invest time-wise on, there's ways to do it without the API full integration. And then, of course, there is ways to basically launch your bot at the point where it's already ready to do all of that. But one of the things we learned by doing the step-by-step integration is, as you mentioned, the language is constantly tweaking and changing, and you're finding different ways as what you're learning from the consumer's behaviors and from the consumer responses that have helped us to tweak some of the modules and will help us tweak some of the modules go forward. So that's kind of the interesting part. Like if we would have designed and said, hey, we're going to go live with this, at go live, it wouldn't have been too far from there that we would have already have made several variation changes very quickly. By going the opposite route, it helped us to learn a little bit about each of the components we were trying to solve for and how we'll continue to structure them in the future.
Thanks. I think that's a really important point to note about going step by step, because I think so many of us, myself definitely included, like you said, want to be at the finish line, right? Let's start, we're finished. And sometimes taking it more methodically can help make things more seamless and easier. Mike, I'd love to hear your thoughts from a compliance perspective. I know as a compliance person, we have our own set of things running through our heads.
Yeah, we're a unique breed, I guess, is a way to say it. No, I think John really summed it up best by, talking about what I like to tell people all the time is crawl, walk, run, right? You've got to start out and utilize the systems and infrastructure, understand exactly how it's going to be successful, and then integrate it or expand it into the next opportunity and let it evolve over time. I've been involved in integrations with companies in this area. And sometimes people will try to boil the ocean and figure out and focus on that 1% and not the 99%. And what ends up happening is it's a 3-year integration and not a 3-month integration. So you're not learning anything during that time frame. You're trying to get everything perfect, and it's never going to get perfect out of the gate. You're going to have to make modifications. So I think John summarized it as well as you possibly can, whether it's an operational or from a compliance perspective, is you've got to go out, identify how you can use the process at that 10 or 15 percentile and bring an agent in over the top at that point. So you can understand how the process is going to work and evolve throughout. We talked a little bit about the APIs and getting the data back. That's probably one of the most important pieces from a compliance standpoint. The earlier you can do an API integration, the better, because you're going to get real-time data back and forth. And one of the biggest concerns that compliance people are going to tell you is that the opt-outs. How do you manage your opt-outs? And you have to provide the opt-out opportunity. And each time a consumer opts out, you better be fairly confident that you're going to be able to manage that opt-out and not continue in that communication effect. And that doesn't matter if it's an AI bot or if it's text messaging or email or whatever the communication channel you're working with. You have to be able to have the capability to make real-time decisions and make sure that you're treating that consumer, with the communication preference that they've already requested and opting out, acknowledging those. So, the sooner you can get to that point, the better, but you're not going to get there day one, right? So you're going to have daily files. The requirement around that is to be able to set up rules. So whether it's on the vendor side or in your CRM side or wherever you need to do it, you'll have the capability to be able to provide those rules so they can discontinue those communication channels in that moment on one side or the other, and then provide daily file outlays to update the underlying CRM later on in the afternoon or whenever at night, whenever that process is. So I think those are the areas that, John hit it on the head, is you need to take the time, learn from the systems, and then evolve it as you get comfortable, and both from an ops and from a compliance perspective. I wouldn't pinpoint one specific thing that you need to do right out of the gate, other than have a mindset that we've already touched on too, is that you're not going to try to boil the ocean right out of the gate. If you do that, you're just going to have a lot of problems, and your integration time is going to be tenfold what it would be if you took the other perspective.
Well, thanks. thanks. And having heard all of your responses, I also heard something in there that goes back to the first question, and that is compliance and ops working together along with the vendor, and that's really what one of the underlying themes what I heard from all of your answers was if you're working together, that implementation is going to go is going to be more seamless than if it's just one group running it and leaving the other out or something like that. So thank you. It was helpful for me, and I hope it's helpful for for the registrants who will get this on video and the attendees. And I do want to pause here just to say if any of the attendees want to ask a question, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom or the chat. Either one, Q&A works a little better, but sometimes people don't see that. So either way, feel free to to hop in with questions. So all three of you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to specifically ask the question. In terms of experience, I know that all three of you are experienced in setting up an artificial intelligence solution. What would you say that first quarter should look like? It sounds like the first week you shouldn't expect to see too much, nor in the first month, but I'm going to ask the question kind of two different ways. What's an appropriate time frame to start seeing some results, and what do you think the first quarter should look like? So again, I'm not going to pick anyone out to go first, but we'll just hop in whichever one of you wants to tackle that first.
I mean, what we saw typically within a week's time frame, based on the volume of calls, that's typically what we're able to monitor and see as a track to success. So, in that first quarter, I mean, again, it depends on what you're ultimately trying to capture. Are you trying to get to the point of launching where you're taking payments? Are you getting to the point of where you're trying to eliminate back office support, like paid in full letters or things that the consumer can self-serve? But in our piece, what we can clearly see is based on the incoming volume is typically week over week, you can implement different testing scenarios to gauge out what you're looking to try to accomplish. For example, consumers naturally say 17 different ways for a customer service agent, right? And the whole point of the AI, what we're ultimately designing for is how do I find out why they want an agent, and can we eventually push that into self-serve traffic? So, each week we implement a new phrasing to determine what's the ultimate success. And so, when we say, customer service agent, or they say, representative, we then do a test where we pose a question, hey, to get you to the right department, could you explain a little bit about what you're looking to do so I can get you to that right department and save time? So, when you launch something like that, within a week, you can typically see what traffic now got classified into subcategories versus, what still continues to push to a rep. And each time you make a change to kind of that overall question that you're asking, it's crazy to see that just some slight variations to that specific sentence can dramatically increase or decrease the outcome of, I want to make a payment, or I'm disputing my account, or I have, a question about charges. And so, that's where this becomes really key for us. And to just, the wave of technology is because in a traditional IVR, you're not listening to all of those variances and nuances. And it's typically a traditional recorded, message prompt. And if you're having to redo it, you're constantly having to reload potentially or re-record that message prompt. And so with AI, it makes it super quick and fast to, put the new step in place and quickly see the results right after launch. And so for us, I think within Q1, we could clearly identify a extremely large portion of traffic that was wanting representatives, and could help us really determine, what portion could we solve with AI by, moving forward with this module versus this one, and what portion are we still trying to figure out why this, consumer actively wants to reach an agent. But the good part about that is I know a lot of companies are looking into the post-call recordings. So again, that's a good piece for post-call recordings, is to say, okay, hey, this 20%, I can't get them to tell me that they specifically want to do, X, Y, or Z. But then you can go listen to those post-call recordings or ingest them into a different, tool or vendor, and you can start to hone in on different key aspects that you can then add to your AI, and you can condition consumers. Like when a consumer, says representative and you pose question number 2, in knowing what you've learned from the 20%, you can then pose a secondary question And what you'll find is you think maybe the consumers are going to get annoyed or bailed, but no, that's not necessarily the case. It actually hones in to help them, accept even a higher portion. And so you continue pushing to the ultimate success, which is, how high can I take, self-serve and the AI bot to do what an agent used to do?
That's really interesting. So it sounds like even though you took a don't boil the ocean approach, you saw some immediate results, as if I heard that correctly. That's very interesting, I think.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think the other thing, just to add that, and he summarized that really, really well. I think where we found some trouble with people too, and obviously not with John, but in some other implementations was really once you got to a point where the system could actually verify the consumer and then move past that, everybody in this space, and I wouldn't say everybody, that's not a fair term, but a lot of people in the space are so concerned about consumer verification that they overcomplicate that process. That's what I've seen anyway in an IVA setting with the voice bots, because you can do a certain amount of information, whether it's live and attended with an agent or when it's utilizing a voice bot. But that's the area that I found the most troubling for agencies as they implemented this type of a process, is trying to gather too much or too specific information of that consumer before they actually verified who it was and then moved on to providing the disclosures and things like that. People got trapped in that area. And that's where a lot of them saw here, like they would have a lot of traffic into it and then it would fall out. And it fell out almost always when they were trying to verify too much information from the consumer before they got there. Now, obviously, you have to be compliant. You have to identify who it is before you disclose information. But sometimes that gets overdone in agencies, and people who are going to ask for the firstborn and blood type and all that other kind of stuff. You got to be really careful on how you manage it and how you present it. I think John pinpointed, you're going to ask a specific question and move on to another question. What we see a lot of times that is problematic, even in payment portals, is you're going to ask the consumer, in a login for their name, and then you're going to ask them for this, or this, instead of just asking for the one piece of information. Which it's going to allow that person to move through that process a lot quicker, presenting one question at a time rather than here's 3 options, because then they have to make a decision. There may be a drop down, there may be something like that. Same thing on the phone. If you ask them, hey, provide me your zip or your social or this or that, date of birth, they're going to probably hang up at that point. They may not know how to answer it. They might not remember what you said, push 1, 2, or 3. Just ask them the one question and move to the next one. So that's one of the areas that I've seen a lot of problems too, is just getting through, trying to get to the question or the answer that you're looking for to verify who the consumer is and then move on, rather than trying to throw a bunch of questions at them and then have them select from those series of questions. It's almost that, when you get asked a question, but it's in 4 parts and you can't remember the third one when you get to that point and you have to re-ask the question. Don't put the consumer in a position like that. Just ask them that one question, then move to the next question after they respond.
I think John, just adding to, I think John and Mike have covered quite a few points. I think I'll just kind of speak from the experience from the vendor side. I think what we have seen is typically, I think the implementations kind of fall into 2 buckets. There's one bucket where people are comfortable with out-of-box solutions, and that is something which we have experienced. Some of the things which kind of Mike talked about in terms of, is it kind of the right parameters to kind of use for verification, which are the ones which are easiest for the voice bot to implement, people are comfortable sharing, versus what you might be using in your current process or the current script. I think, that is something which we can bring to the table as vendors, having worked across customers and having a more understanding in terms of, the bot and the customer behavior with respect to the bot. So I think if you're kind of comfortable with the out-of-box solutions with some minor configuration changes, etc., the good part is you can have the bot running quite quickly. It may not give you the full kind of impact of, probably what a customized bot might give, but then at least you will start seeing, kind of results and numbers and kind of uptake both in RPCs, connects, as well as in payments, probably from the first month itself. And then you can kind of, start tweaking it more in terms of kind of reading how is the funnel kind of looking like. Are there any particular point when we are seeing a lot of drop-offs, where we are seeing a lower engagement, and you can kind of do some tweaks there and keep on improving. The other approach is the, kind of the approach which John had kind of elaborated, where, you effectively don't want to kind of jump in all in. You want to kind of build it very specified to the way you want it set up, and which will kind of work for your own setup. And I think that's a call which I think the customer will have to take. There are obviously trade-offs, right? If you kind of go the first approach, you will start seeing results much sooner. You'll start seeing value much sooner, but you may not be able to kind of fully optimize it to your operations. But on the other hand, if you kind of go the other approach, you will start seeing results, but obviously, it'll take some time to ramp up, but it can be much integrated with the way you have been running operations until now.
Thanks. Hearing experience is definitely helpful, and I want to you guys each touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to just ask the question directly. What is in each of your opinions? What is the or experience? Where should someone who has recently implemented artificial intelligence solutions, where do you think they'll see the first noticeable difference? Where do you think they'll really get a point to stand back and go, wow, like that is something that has totally changed just from this implementation? I'd love to hear it from all three of your perspectives.
I think typically, maybe I'll speak, I think because across, kind of the customers that we have work with, I think the two things which immediately kind of stands out for them is the number of connects that they start making. And I'm talking specifically about a voice bot, right? Because effectively, it's theoretically infinitely scalable. So effectively, the number of connects that they start making versus, what they were making earlier. And then correspondingly, I think obviously, the inbound traffic which starts coming into their agents, right? So those are kind of the two numbers which immediately kind of see a massive jump right from, in fact, day one itself. Right. And it's very obvious. Now, obviously, as you go down the funnel, some of the other numbers change, but I think some of it might take some time to kind of evolve and, see an impact. But these two numbers definitely, right from the day when we have seen customers kind of seeing a major impact.
I think from our side, the interesting piece is, traditional IVR doesn't really require the consumer to speak. It's typically key presses and, decision trees. And these AIs, especially as we're learning about all the new tools and vendors who are coming into the market for voice analytics and, agent assist or notes capture, et cetera. For the first time, this is allowing a full inbound conversation with a consumer to be recorded in natural language. And that's, what's really helping to perfect, I think, all of the things that are still yet to come in our industry and how we're going to use them. But, being able to know the best way to flow a conversation based on how a consumer would engage. And so, for us, like I said, when we first started down the inbound path, the first thing when we prompted the consumer was, how can we help you today? In some cases, traditionally, it would be, you could say things like make a payment or X, like it's prompting the consumer in which to respond or how to respond to get an outcome. And so what we kind of did for the first test was say, let's allow the consumer natural language just to tell us what they want to do so that we're not driving them to a specific outcome. So we can ingest all the different variations of how do you say make a payment? How do you say representative? Some people say, I need a bill, I need an invoice, I need a description of charges. So for us, what we really saw was just, how different a lot of consumers ultimately say what they're looking to do, even though the end result is the same. It was just very eye-opening to see all of the utterances and all of the different, recordings of what they were saying and what it ultimately translated into at the end. So for us, that was just a way to really see how we need to continue to evolve the marketing side of things. And like I said, what we're asking the consumer, what we're responding, that's where it's going to continue to evolve, I think, a lot in the next, few years with AI.
I agree. And that correlates to the compliance side just as much as the ops. I mean, ops, you're looking at how can you, determine if the consumer is asking you for a payment, but the same thing holds true in opt-outs, right? So people say it all in different ways. So a lot of times, and if you look at it on text messages, now you have emojis and all these other types of things. But in the voice bot world, you're still going to have people say stop or please don't call me again. There's just going to be a million variations of exactly how you have to codify those. And for the machine to be able to learn and understand what those elements are and then decipher the strategy on what you need to identify or code your account. It takes time, but it's also pretty intriguing to see the variations in some of those responses. So And I don't know that it's even regional or anything like that. I think it's just there's a variation all across the United States on how people are going to respond to specific questions. So I like what John suggested is kind of keep it open as much as you can early so you can learn and decipher from the consumer's interaction with the bot itself.
Wonderful, thank you. That's helpful because sometimes it's good just to hear what others' experiences have been, and that you know everyone's looking for that point of where can I see something, you know. Before we go on this line of questioning, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Some I'm going to get to at the end, but I do want to address this one now because it came up now, and I had 4 or 5 people ask it in the registration. Mike, this one is for you. It is in terms of compliance, what limits do you see in regards to the recent FCC ruling about artificial intelligence? What are your thoughts on that? And what are your thoughts
I don't
on
know
that?
that it, yeah, I don't know that it changed a whole lot. I think the FCC did, in my opinion, in my read of the FCC's, declaratory opinion was really twofold. One was, they're trying to make an inference on what term did they use? They used a term in there about like programming a specific type of voice. So they're trying to basically cover voice inflection or some type of I can't remember the term that they used. I wish I had at the top of my tongue, but it was trying to create some type of a voice override, if you will, to make the consumer believe they're speaking to a person or something that it really isn't speaking to, right? So that was one piece of it. The other piece was really just focused on consent, right? So it's something that we've been working along the whole way, kind of like what happened with the director opt voicemails from the FCC about a year or 2 years ago, where they said, hey, you need to have consent and then it's viable. It kind of felt like the same type of statement that the FCC was making was really like, hey, as long as you've got direct consumer consent or prior, express consumer consent, and that consent is focused on artificial intelligence or artificial voice, then you have no problem being able to communicate with that consumer in that threshold. So, I don't know that it was earth-shattering. I think the real focus is trying to differentiate, obviously, for consented calls, but then also what are these other types of technologies that are coming out that are changing, voice to make it sound like the consumer is speaking to somebody that it's not. Which is a little bit unique. It's not something that we're really dealing with the bots today. I know there's some platforms out there that are helping from language dialects, right? So they're looking to help the language dialect be modified by voice overrides, but I don't know that that's truly what they were trying to get at in the FCC opinion. I think it was more focused on scammers trying to present as something that it's not with that voice articulation. So I think for us in our space that, again, just like we deal with other communication channels, trying to make sure that we can capture the right consent from the creditor and make sure we have the right language and that underlying consent that allows it to pass to the debt collector, so we can utilize this on outbounds and inbounds alike.
Thanks, Mike. I know that question has come up a lot. So I appreciate you giving us that some insight there. And then I'm going to, before we get into artificial intelligence in the future, I want to ask the panel another question that came in here that fits into what we've just been talking about. And the question from the person is it safe to say that the artificial intelligence strategy is initially based on assumptions and then conducting experiments within the AI test to test where the limits are and where it should go? Is that a fair statement? Start with assumptions and then mess around with it, to say it a little less eloquently.
I think you can. For the most part, somebody going into the AI and the collection space is not starting from scratch, meaning this is their first inbound collection call. So, I think you can make a pretty good assumption of what a starting point would be. But definitely, one of the things I always say is continue to test until you meet a metric that you feel is top notch and is acceptable, that says, hey, I have other areas of focus. I'm perfectly happy with this result that I'm getting at this point, so that I can focus over here. And so, like I said, in our testing scenarios there, when you're launching a bot, we found cases of, high silence. So our first mission was, wow, we're seeing a percentage of calls that are just silent, like, hey, how can we help you today? And we're getting nothing. So our test was, hey, we want to implement, something that calls out saying, hey, I didn't catch that, I didn't hear that. And again, there's several different variations you can ask that same kind of question. And depending on which one you go with could have, a better or worse result. But when we impose that second question again, it's like, hey, I didn't catch that. Could you repeat that? Silence went from like 20% down to 10, and it remained flat from that point forward. Could we have said, ultimately, do I want to get to zero? Yes, but what we started to focus in on more at that point in time was now we're getting a high enough percentage of consumers to at least say something. The next focus point was, what are they saying? And then again, when we saw agent or representative or anything that's driving to an outcome that's not self-serve with the bot, the next focus was that piece of saying, okay, now we need to create testing scenarios. We need to create our testing strategy. How long will we monitor for success? And what do we consider success? And then ultimately, you just create those baselines and benchmarks, and then you constantly repeat against those tests again until you are at a point where you're at an acceptable level to say, we can maintain here. Now we need to shift to here. In some cases, if there's resources, you can absolutely run, multiple tests. But where AI gets tricky is really being able to gauge, which one of those tests led to the overall ending success if they have some overlapping or similarities. So that's the only thing about, I say, when you're running the multiple tests where it gets tricky. But yeah, like that was us. We made some assumptions, went with a standard, kind of inbound script flow, and then what we partnered with, and this is where I think is kind of interesting now, in these past few years than ever before, is we work heavily with our marketing team. These people are designed and they go to school to learn a lot of different characteristics and traits and things about how to engage, with consumers and clients. And so we work with them heavily in saying, yeah, we may have taken something out of the box, but we can quickly, push that to our marketing team and say, hey, what's your thoughts on this? Do you think we could reword it? It doesn't take long for somebody to review a quick sentence or two and tell you, hey, I think this would go a lot better than what we're using now. And so we can, again, set that test, implement it, and watch what happens to the results.
Thanks. And Mike, do you have anything to add to that? Otherwise, I'm going to hop into voice AI in the future because I really do want to cover that topic.
Sure.
I think I'll add one point quickly, if it's okay, Missy, on the point Sean made, right? I don't think there is a reason to kind of base AI strategy on assumptions. I think it's a technology which has been around for the last 2-3 years. I think there are multiple vendors and multiple your fellow agencies which have been kind of dabbling with different aspects of AI. I think probably it might be good to just get into a discussion, kind of test out a few scenarios, and then kind of do all the experimentations which kind of John talked about, right, to further improve on it. So I don't think you need to kind of start completely in the dark. I think there are enough examples, enough implemented use cases out there. Just find stuff which is kind of very similar to which has worked for an agency very similar to you. Probably that's a good starting point, and then kind of further start experimenting to kind of build on it.
Wonderful, thank you. Mike, did you have anything to add before I move on, or are you?
No.
Okay. So the reason I'm so eager to get to talking about artificial intelligence in the future is one of the things that I know I've been hearing in the industry, and I'm sure y'all have been hearing, and I'm sure those on the call have been hearing is, do I or don't I? Do I step in? Do I not step in? What happens if I don't step in? Where am I going to be left behind? What happens? So I'd love to ask all three of you, basically, where do you see artificial intelligence taking us in the next year, in the next 5 years? Hearing it, I think, from a vendor's perspective of where you see it on the tech side going, and on the ops side where you see it going, John, and on the compliance side where you see it going, Mike. Where do you think this is taking us in the next year or 5 years, and what happens to what's the risk of not getting involved? Open-ended. Hop in.
I'll hop in. I think the risk of not getting involved in AI is the same risk that we saw 4 or 5 years ago of agencies that didn't want to get involved in text and email. They fall behind the curve. Limiting your ability as a debt collector to communicate in every single available channel that may be out there is just it's a limiting factor in your capabilities to perform at the same levels that every other agency may be able to perform at. So for me, me as an agency owner in the past too, I would never limit myself in the capabilities that my company would have been able to provide that service. And by not utilizing AI, you're going to miss out on a portion of the population that you may otherwise have an opportunity if you're using AI. No different than text or email. You're going to lose out on that portion of the population that wants to communicate, and that's a preferred method of communication. So to me, it does not just that, but it does another thing, which is right now we're having a struggle with employment. We can't hire in the US, right? Some people, nearshore, offshore is another option if we can do it. It's not all contracts are going to allow for either of those, right? So you're going to have to come up with some type of solutions that are going to that will allow you to maintain some competitive advantage there, or at least stay with the competition. And I think a lot of that is going to be moving to technology-based communications. And so to answer the question without, directly, it's why would you ever put yourself in a position where you're going to fall behind the competition by not utilizing technology that others are going to use? So for me, it's about getting it right as well. And that's the differentiator. Just like any football team in the United States, they may all have the same playbook, they may have a better playbook, but if you can't go out and actually execute on the playbook that you designed, you're probably going to lose. And that's the same thing here. When you've got operators like John and Amit with it as a vendor that are able to bring the technology to you, and John's able to implement that and do it in the right way, he's going to be out in front of his competition. So it's the same theory when you think about it from a sports analogy is, how you were able to implement these technologies. First, embrace them and understand you're going to have to use them, right? Or to be competitive. Second is how do you implement them the safest and the best way without cutting off the ability to generate what you're trying to generate, which is revenue, and being overly compliant in situations and sometimes trying to solve for that 1% like we talked about earlier. But I think anybody that's not going to get involved here is going to be a step behind. So you have to figure out a way to get involved. And again, it's going to be everybody's going to have a different level of risk continuum that they're willing to take, and they're going to crawl a little bit longer or a little bit faster than the next company and then jump to the next phase. But it is a learning process, and people need to get involved in it if you're not involved in it today. One thing before you move it to somebody else, it was bothering me because I couldn't remember the terminology the FCC used. But I pulled it back up, and it's actually now I lost it again. But they were basically mimicking people's voices. Voice cloning is the terminology that they used in the opinion. And that voice cloning was actually looking at celebrities and different type of people's voices that they were trying to emulate, which is really what they were trying to crack down on, not so much debt collectors. So that was one piece I wasn't able to provide earlier that I want to make sure I could clarify.
Thanks, Mike. John, Amit, which one do you want us to go next?
Go ahead, man.
Yeah, I think from the technology side, I think I really like the analogy, Mike, which you kind of put forward for sports. I think some of you guys might have heard of the book and the movie Moneyball, right? Where the Oakland kind of uses analytics to kind of really do a lean budget impact. I think that's kind of something very similar, which will play out if you're not kind of jumping onto the AI bandwagon, right? Because it's something which will enable you to do more with less, right? And effectively, that's kind of the central tenet in on which collections industry, ARM industry kind of operates, right? And I think it's important that you are latching on to it first before any of your competitors are, just to kind of ensure that you get that advantage. In terms of how things will evolve, I think it's been evolving rapidly. I think if you guys have been kind of following news, I think you had like GPT-4, now there's going to be GPT-5 kind of coming in. And with every kind of model and every model of LLM which kind of comes in, we are seeing, the capabilities are like immense, right? I think it's kind of getting very close to how a human kind of thinks. Obviously, there are going to be limitations. What I've also seen is a fear that, it's going to completely replace humans. Now, at the end of the day, there is obviously a logical part, reasoning part, and there's also an emotional and a personal reasoning part. I think for that, you will be needing the human touch. But then the good part is, I think it's going to be something which is going to be needed only for the complex activities, and some of the simpler things, more and more of the simpler things are going to be kind of offloaded to the machine, right? So I think I can clearly see 5 years down the line, some of those usual mundane repetitive activities and even some of the lower dates, debts which do not require a lot of complex negotiations, etc. I can clearly see a lot of it getting completely handled by the machine, by AI. And similarly, I think, moving beyond just voice bots, I think there are obviously other aspects where there can be a lot of AI which can be used for training the agents, or kind of making the agents much more kind of efficient as well, so that effectively they can handle more and more of those complex scenarios as well. There is going to be a better way in which the systems can read with each other, because even now a lot of the systems, a lot of the partner systems which are in place are not AI compatible, right? But gradually they are also realizing it and they are becoming it. So systems can speak with each other. And I think we'll come to a stage where, you will kind of reach a equilibrium where, you'll have humans obviously for stuff which is very difficult to pull off, but and you can be very efficient. Some of the staffing concerns will be addressed, but then you will have AI for handling most of the simpler things, things which a lot of the humans are not even interested and don't even find it enjoyable to kind of do.
Wonderful. Thank you. John?
Yeah, I think over this next year, a lot of companies who may have not been entertaining it are definitely ears perked up, a lot more visual and vocal in the conferences, and different peer groups. So I think over the next year, there's going to be continuous insight in agencies wanting to get into this technology. Over the next 2 to 3 years, even close to 5, I don't know to what level it ultimately gets at as far as staffing needs. But one of the things right now that we look at it for is any self-serve or agentless tool that we have has all been to supplement cost and allow growth without the capacity to hire like we used to. So it hasn't led into an immediate need to say, all right, great, we just implemented an AI bot, so we can go ahead and drop 10 FTE. It's more about saying now, if you're out there and looking in the acquisitions phase, or you're out there, bringing on new clients, it's an opportunity to allow, exponential growth without the same FTE need that you used to. So, when you look at it from a cost and a ROI perspective, you're able to be way more competitive than the competition not using this technology. And I think that's what is becoming eye-opening is that a lot more of the conversations I've had at some of the conferences is not about FTE replacement anymore. It's about lowering costs to be more competitive in the market, and be able to challenge contracts and sizes that they may not have been able to prior. So I think over the next year, that's what we're going to see is really how can AI help a company, maintain or lower those costs so that they can grow to a bigger size and produce more profit, not through just the old traditional way of saying, hey, let's maintain revenue and cut costs by FTE because it's one of the highest cost piece that we have. That's kind of what I'm seeing shift over the next year and into probably 3 to 5.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Just
And
one additional comment to that. I think John makes a great point, because a lot of agencies are segmenting accounts out and they're not even working a series of accounts because they can't afford to, right? Because the margin is just not there if they utilize the historic process. So this is another area that you can use the AI bot and some other communication channels to be able to effectuate some of those accounts that you otherwise wouldn't work and generate a higher level of revenue.
thanks. I think that's very helpful to hear where y'all see it going from your different perspectives. And I see, Mike, that you want to answer a question live, but before we get there, oh, did you not mean to hit that?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a little note on one of the questions that we don't have time for that. So
I'll get the responses out. I was trying to respond
okay.
to it just with
Good.
the typing and it screwed up.
All right, great.
Because I'm so technology savvy, right?
We're getting there. I do want to just say to everyone who's been listening today that we are going to send this out by email. So if you're a compliance person who's listened in and you want your ops person to hear this, you can forward it to them, and vice versa. If you're an ops person and you want your compliance to hear, to hear about this from a compliance perspective, feel free to forward it. We are going to send it on. So I am going to, at this point, thank our sponsor, Skit AI, for sponsoring this webinar. And we have about 5 minutes left, but I know people tend to jump because they got a 3 o'clock to get to, or a noon, depending on which coast you're on. But I will ask John, Mike, any other, minute or less parting words for those who have been on?
Yeah, don't fear technology. Just implement responsibly.
Very good.
I would echo that and just say crawl, walk, run, like we talked about today. You've got to put your toe in, learn a little bit, and then expand it a long time. And you'll find a lot of fruit in that labor. And like John said, don't wait to get in early, start learning now, and then expand it over time.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, speak to vendors, speak to your peers who have already been through the journey, understand, and then, kind of take the right and responsible and compliant way to kind of implement. Start early so that you can, you can improve over time, and, you can, you get some time to kind of build and get to the value as well.
Wonderful. Well, John, Mike, I mean, I want to thank you for bringing your unique insight and experience into this conversation. I know I learned a lot. I hope everyone who listened in learned a lot. And for those of you who asked questions that we didn't get to, we do see them, and hopefully we'll be able to address them in a future webinar of some sort. So thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your, is today Thursday? Rest of your Thursday.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.